Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, raising awareness and inspiring action for personal and planetary health, with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody, my name is Ben Adelberg.
And I'm Emma Strutt.
And welcome to episode 27 for season 2. Really excited about today's session because Emma and I have been talking prior to the show, and I feel like it's a good time for me for a little bit of a therapy session. And you'll find out very shortly what we mean by that. Emma, let's just get straight on to the intros.
Okay. So as we record this episode, we are actually days away from a new IPCC report being released. And by the time you listen to this, that report will be out in the world. So no doubt a lot of people out there who are interested in climate science or who are working in this space are a little bit nervous about what those findings will be, just how bad it will be this time round. Keeping up with science regarding the climate emergency can definitely take a toll on people physically and mentally. So today we are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Sally Gillespie, who is going to help us unpack things a little. Sally has a long history of working as a Jungian psychotherapist before she shifted direction somewhat and undertook her doctoral research in climate psychology. Sally now lectures and facilitates workshops on climate psychology and eco-psychology. She's a member of Psychology for a Safe Climate, the Climate Psychology Alliance, and the Climate Wellbeing Network. Sally has also recently published a book on the subject called Climate Crisis and Consciousness, Reimagining Our World and Ourselves. So she really brings an enormous wealth of knowledge to the table on this subject. So Sally, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really appreciative of your time.
Well, thank you very much, Ben and Emma. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, though I didn't have the heads up it was going to be a therapy session. But I totally appreciate the context we are talking in, which is very close to the IPCC report and the stresses of that.
Exactly. So, Sally, let's start off with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and more holistically what you do and how you came to this point.
Okay. So, I am a Pakeha woman. I grew up in Auckland at the foot of Mangakiki, and I think like any one from Aotearoa, just had that experience of a lot of time out in the green and blue of our beautiful country. I grew up there in the 60s and the 70s, so it was a time where you could run wild a little bit more perhaps than kids get to do today. And I think, though I have not lived in Aotearoa since I was 21, since the late 70s, it stays very strongly with me as a basis of my sense of connectedness with the living world. I did work for many years as a psychotherapist and trained in the Jungian tradition, and particularly worked with dreams and sand play. And there was always for me alongside that wanting to stay very connected to the natural world. I did work on bush regeneration and also helped with rewilding of a property of a friend who was actually very active in greenhouse gas challenges, greenhouse gas mitigation, reduction targets and so on in the late 90s and early 2000s. So climate was always on my radar, even though I was also pretty immersed in a psychotherapy world, trained in a model which tends to individualize and privatize distress. But things started to unravel for me around that as I became more aware of the climate crisis deepening, and I really just couldn't keep my attention into the therapy room. I needed to really start grappling with what was going on and what was the psychology behind, first of all, climate denial, but also as I became more immersed, the question came up for me, well, what happens when you become very engaged with climate issues? There's a lot of looking at the denial side, but I was very aware there were campaigners, scientists, policymakers, and myself who were getting really immersed in this stuff. And I wanted to know, is there a psychological journey in this? What can we do to help one another? Because it's a bit hard to invite people into the space if what it means is becoming more depressed and despairing. And for many people at that time, when I started doing my research about 11 years ago, a strong feeling of isolation about being immersed in these areas. So what I did for my research was I set up a group which ran for a year. They were all people who are already very involved with climate issues, as campaigners, policymakers, community workers and so on. And I invited people to come along and really explore what was happening for us at an emotional and psychological level. And what came out was far richer than I ever imagined. People were very engaged. No one dropped out of the research over the year. And the discussions were really deeply absorbing. And what we found fairly quickly was there was a trajectory of what we needed to think about. That came up quite naturally, and I can talk about that in a bit. And that we started to feel better, even though part of that feeling better was acknowledging that there is a real ebb and flow and a flux of emotions that goes with this engagement. And that research left me with a real passion for facilitating particularly conversations to explore the deeper feelings and the meanings and the change of ways of seeing the world that go with an awareness of climate issues for most people in mainstream culture. You know, I'm very aware. I live now in Australia. I live on Gadigal and Wongal land here in Sydney. That both Australia and Aotearoa have very strong Indigenous cultures and traditional ecological knowledge, which I always want to acknowledge and respect, and that continues to exist. It has been very traumatizing experiences for the last couple of 100 years since colonisation, and that too is part of what we're grappling with. But I guess in the work I've been doing, I've been primarily working with people who have been coming through who have been very engaged with climate issues in specific ways.
So Sally, a big theme of your book is the importance of supportive and exploratory conversations to really engage with this climate issue. But talking about climate change and its impacts, it still remains a pretty taboo topic in conversation in a lot of circles. Like, I think if you go to a dinner party, it'd be easier to talk about religion or politics than it would be to talk about the climate emergency. So firstly, why do you think that is, and how can we start fostering the importance of these conversations and making them a normal part of our discourse?
Yeah, I think that's been a very big question from fairly early days in terms of climate work, though I think issues have intensified partly for cultural reasons, in terms of one of the reasons certainly people avoid it now is that it can be very politicised. It has become a very politicised area, and the avoidance can be avoidance of conflict. But I think at a deeper level, in fact I know at a deeper level, it's the kind of feelings that really thinking about the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, those feelings are overwhelming feelings. And where we're in a conversation where we don't feel safe to be able to acknowledge and articulate those feelings and explore them and connect with others, there's a psychological way of trying to maintain a feeling of safeness inside by avoiding it, which is of course counterproductive. But at the same time, people have sometimes had quite bruising encounters because of the politicisation of this area. But as I said, at a deeper level, because we now know that we're in a very severe place with the climate crisis, and it brings up huge existential anxiety and concerns, and with that, a real complexity of emotions that particularly in, I think, Anglo-influenced cultures, we're not always as comfortable with identifying and expressing emotions, and so that also has its challenges too. So there's a whole array of things going on in terms of why we're not having that conversation more, but I think a lot of it is to do with a lack of safety internally at an emotional level, as well as a sense of lack of safety often at a social level too.
And how much of that do you think could be a defensive mechanism? For instance, a classic example are farmers, that might feel that a lot of new policy changes are specifically targeting them, like they're the cause of the issues. So, rather than having constructive conversations and so on, it seems to be a finger pointing and then I'm going to get defensive. I don't want to talk about it. I don't believe there's an issue because I'm not the problem.
Yeah.
There has to be a factor of that as well.
Absolutely, and that of course goes across a whole lot of different sectors. Here in Australia, we've got a lot of fossil fuel industries, a lot of very well-paid jobs through the fossil fuel industries. I shouldn't say a lot. There's certain areas which you get very well paid, and often they're fly-in, fly-out workers too. So that's been a little bit exaggerated. But I think particularly with farmers is a good example. And in a way, it speaks something to our whole worldview when we start to categorise and want a finger point and scapegoat. And I mean, no one wants to enter a conversation where they're feeling they're being scapegoated. So in some ways we have to learn to talk around this issue in a much more inclusive language, because we are all implicated in the causes to greater or lesser extent, and we are all very much needed to be on board to be able to start really addressing what we need to do to both reduce severity and to build resilience. So I think, I think there's a lot of work now being done and realising that it is counterproductive to go into various different communities and work sectors with this idea of pinning the blame. I think there is an underlying sense of enormous guilt in a lot of Western affluent countries which have been big emitters, and most people who are doing okay in countries like Australia and Aotearoa are aware that they're part of the problem. And a lot of guilt can come up, that especially when it starts to get personal. We think, well, what's the world going to be like for our children and for our grandchildren? And that's a huge one. I mean, the story with farmers is there's such a positive story in the sense of how much farmers can do to really be able to help the situation through regenerative farming practices and carbon sequestration in soils and so on. So there, I think, what seems to come out is that peer education works very well. That no one likes to have someone turn up in their community who doesn't have those connections and necessarily not experience. So it's really important to get peer education working around all that, and to be talking the language that is familiar, and to be showing familiarity with the very real challenges and conflicts that can come up when we embark on major change.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned children just before, and I don't think that anyone who's engaged with the climate issue will quickly forget Greta's speech in 2019, where she stood up in front of the world and she discussed how her childhood and her dreams had basically been stolen from her because of inaction on this issue. And I think this is a hugely confronting topic for a lot of people because, again, you mentioned this in your book, we're having to deal with our disintegrating worldviews that we may have once held. And I know the narrative that I was told and grew up with about, what my future might look like, that's completely changed now. I'm just one of many people I know that are choosing not to have kids because of where we're headed with the climate. People are changing the way they travel, what they eat, how they consume. I've got a lot of friends that are honestly, who have made that choice not to have kids. They're going through a grieving process for the loss of the children that they're never going to have now. How do we come to grips with, these waves of climate grief and anxiety that so many people are experiencing? How do we cultivate some grounded hope in this time of, so much uncertainty and change?
The big questions, isn't it?
It's a tough one.
It is tough, and I think particularly that, there's so much to grieve, but that particular grief of deciding not to have children in these circumstances, or the grief of deciding to have children, knowing that the children that you are bringing into the world are facing very uncertain and major changes and lack of securities and so on, securities that were familiar to us. I think the first thing is, of course, to acknowledge and name that grief, and to know and to experience that you're not alone in it. These decisions feel very individual. They are being taken within a sense, within that collective knowledge and that collective experience. And I think they need to be processed collectively as much as they are experienced at an individual level, because it feels very different when someone can say, I know, I feel that too, I've been grappling with that one too. And to also to be able to hear the conflicts, because no decision is without conflict, even though it might become very clear, or you might have a strong intuition, or whatever has driven, what has informed that decision. There's always enormous challenge within that, and conflicts within that, and we need to air it and acknowledge it, and we need to experience not being alone. We need to establish safe places for conversations, ones where we really commit to listening to one another, not interrupting, not going into an argument or into the politics or so on, but to actually say, let's all take a turn just to say, how is it really for you? You know, whether it's around that specific decision around having children, or whether it's other sorts of decisions, as well as fears and anxieties. And in a way, this can really be a part of preparing the ground for what some people might call grounded hope, or radical hope, or active hope. Different forms of hope which are not grounded in optimism, are not grounded in the idea, well, things will work out. There'll be that magic technology, or something will happen, or it's not really, you know, all those sort of defences that we have very understandably used. And I think every one of us has been through phases and times and moments where we've had, you know, go through that. But as you said, as the science is getting more and more clear, and we're tracking it at the more serious end of the models, we have to interrogate the idea of hope, and come up with what many people have articulated is a kind of grounded hope, which is a discipline and a practice, which is about acting on our values, acting on the world we would like to see, without that promise that it will work out in that way, but that we are working along the trajectory of what we value most. And at a personal level, I know for me, a lot of that has come, one of the ways I've kept myself sustained through, you know, doing over 12 years in this area, has been to spend a lot of time. I mean, I live in the inner city, but I spend a lot of time outside around trees. I work in a community garden. I'm part of a management for a permaculture food forest here in our local park. And, you know, those things really ground me in a lot of what matters. It means I do a lot of reading around regenerative farming and soils and permaculture, and they give me a sense of a different way we could be living, a different way we could be doing our food organising, a different way we could be working with our precious biosphere. And that, though it's just a small part, it feels very, it strengthens me to be working in alignment with that, even though there are, of course, heaps of compromises I have to make in the course of an inner city life, but that's part of it. So we need to find that bit of passion and that bit of inspiration that we really want to put some energy into, and that will feel I'm doing something that is moving the trajectory towards a healing trajectory, rather than falling into a sense of overwhelm and despair which says I can't do anything and nothing I do matters, which is not true. We know from our living world that it responds very well to encouragement and support, to renew, regenerate, repair, and so on. And it's, so that for me is part of it at a personal level. I think we all have a journey and an exploration to do, And I think we very much need to do it together and to be discussing this, because there's so many things we can't get our heads around just by ourselves.
Just to expand on that a little bit, and this will apply probably to a broader audience, and I'm certainly putting myself at the top of this list, is the more, generally it's a good thing, the more you read, the more you feel you don't know because there's so much information in general. When it comes to this whole climate science and so on, especially with this podcast, we're raising a lot of issues. And we tend to finish a lot of our episodes with, okay, this might sound like doom and gloom, let's finish on a positive. But it's very easy for me, and I'll speak from my personal experience. Every book I now read, every paper I read, every conversation I read, I feel more anger. I feel more, I don't want to use the word specifically depressed, but I feel like, what are we as a society doing? We feel helpless. And, I can only imagine to what level a lot of academics and actual researchers and scientists that have been involved in this, their whole lives must feel. But how, you talk about the whole grounded approach, and I like that. But myself as a trail runner, I spend many hours every week out in nature. I mean, it's my place that I just feel so at ease. Yet I now find myself doing what I should be doing to help me relax, remove myself from the stresses and so on. I'm now in that environment thinking, gosh, this might not now be here in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
I'm running along waterways where that's polluted. I know it is. Or, I'm actually now seeing the destruction, and I'm seeing a lot of the issues by actually being immersed out in nature. So how, the word doomerism is a word now that's being floated around a lot more. It does feel like that. How, what do we do? Do we need to start blocking it out and just living our lives day to day? Or what can we actually do to keep ourselves sane and to keep ourselves hopeful?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and so I'm really glad you brought it up, Ben. And I think, I've heard many people talk about that same experiences you're talking about, in terms of both overwhelm of reading material and also finding that you can't leave your grief at the door when you go out into a more natural environment. Look, first of all, I want to address, especially the IPCC report coming out, the fact how traumatizing it is reading about climate information. And that's not often recognized, and yet, we see it over and over again. We might go to a presentation at a conference or something on climate, and over again, up go the graphs and out comes the statistics, and 10 minutes in, people are not only depressed, they're actually traumatized. And we need to be recognizing this and working with this in a little bit more of a sophisticated, psychologically informed way, in terms of both how we communicate with others, but also how we take the information in ourselves. It is not only okay, it is vital to restrict the amount of reading you do, to really think about, okay, what do I actually need to know? I don't need to read every report. I don't need to spend every morning on my feed clicking and clicking and clicking. It's quite a good idea to actually, depending on what your work is and your level of engagement with this and your need to know the specifics of the science, to put a time aside and say, oh, that's work time and I will look at this. We've just put out a media report in terms of preparing people for the IPCC report in Psychology for Safe Climate, and one of the things we've suggested is that people don't read that report alone, that they get together with a couple of colleagues or in their group, if they're a part of a group, and do a reading a bit of a time, taking breaks to check in with how each other's feeling, to maybe do a little mindfulness breathing, to maybe do some stretching, because our nervous system, the cortisol goes up, we're going into a state of alarm, and we cannot think well, we cannot process well, and we're more likely to then become depressed and overwhelmed. And when we feel totally overwhelmed, that all the forces are against us, that's when we tend to fall into the apocalyptic or doomer narrative. at a psychological level. So we need to always be looking at how we are in our level of interaction with this material, and as well as looking at are we dealing with this at a more engaging with a more collaborative and collective way, which is what's needed, rather than, one of the big problems of Western neoliberalism is to individualize everything. Are we sitting alone with the reports or with the whatever and just getting very isolated and overwhelmed in how we feel? So I give permission not only to not, click on too much, to have days off, to have weeks off if you need to. Yeah, I certainly do. Some days I go,
no. I've got so many books to read, to get through, and so many papers.
Yeah, but you, and I'm not saying don't read the books, but choose carefully when, how much, and know that you actually know the essentials of what you need to know.
And
I feel like I know nothing, so I need to know more.
So I don't want to come out as don't ever read anything. That you've got to moderate. You have to.
But
moderate.
it's true, because you become so immersed in it that you forget to come up for breath effectively. And
you effectively are not breathing. Your cortisol levels gone up. You've gone into a state of alarm, flight, fight, freeze. All of those states. And you will not be able to cognitively process what you're reading. In fact, you'll be sort of layering a sense of alarm over and grief. So let's talk about grief. Grief is a very natural and necessary part of life, given that we are mortal creatures, and everything on this earth has its lifespan, and the loss is an enormous part of what life is. Again, the Western dominant culture has become very much a culture of death denial. When we started our research group, the first thing we talked all shared our apocalyptic imaginings, which were extremely, they would die, and then after a while they became very funny as we started sharing them. And this is where sometimes when you get together and others and start talking openly, you can really shift the mood, as opposed to because what you might be imagining at 4 o'clock in the morning, when you start bringing out and comparing to other people, starts to become quite a different thing. And once we got through those apocalyptic imaginings, we all have them, that's obviously part of the territory. What we then needed to talk about, and this is quite spontaneous, this wasn't me leading the conversation, is we started talking about death and our experiences of death in life. When we'd been with people who are dying, how we felt about our own death, what we thought, death, what happened with death, all of these things. And these are very healthy conversations to have, but we don't have them very much in a lot of parts of our more dominant culture. And it's left us more aversive to death, and therefore less able to deal with issues like climate, which so much talk about limits and loss and death, as much as they might invite us into a very different way of living, which is life cultivating and life nurturing, but in a sense of an ecosystemic sense, where we understand our life to be a little link in a very, very long chain of life, or a tiny thread in a web or whatever. So part of this is grief, and when we came to talk about grief in our research group, we not only talked about the grief about what we felt in various parts of the world and what was going on, we also talked about the grief that you touched on before, Emma, the grief of the life we were not going to have, that we might have thought we were going to have when we were young, or the life that we've seen parents have that will not be replicated by us or by the next generations. And again, we need to sit together, just as you will sit in a wake or a tangi, and really say, I feel the loss, I'm sad, and there needs to be tears sometimes. And that acknowledging of grief, and grief needs to be acknowledged collectively. It's a collective experience in life. The losses that we're having may feel very individual, but you'll find many echoes when you start to talk with others. And I think this is where we need the arts a lot too. We need rituals, we need memorials, we need ways of collectively, a bit like Greek tragedy, coming together and really being able to say, there are these losses, and we need to feel sad together, and we need to come out feeling strengthened in our love, knowing that what was lost is so precious. that we need to bond together and to be more committed to what we love. And so, it's finding that sweet spot between kind of the old armouring up. We're not, so many activists and campaigners feel, we can't feel sad, we can't admit to feeling hopeless or grieving because that's admitting defeat. And that kind of heroic stance, which can be very emotionally repressive and often ends in burnout. Or really taking the time and establishing the safety with others to acknowledge the feelings that we're all carrying in this area, and to find within that strength, resilience, connection, and renewed sense of love and commitment, knowing what's at stake and what's being lost.
Now, you've mentioned this a couple of times actually, but we usually look at this issue through a particular paradigm, so we're usually framing it through that neoliberal lens. And again, you've already acknowledged this, but I think it's really important to just make mention that this climate grief disproportionately affects different groups. So people with a real connection to land and nature, so like farmers or Indigenous populations, and then of course young people who are actually growing up with these conversations about how bleak the future is looking. That can't be easy for them. So is there anything different or anything more that we could be doing in this space to support those particular groups?
Well, so much more. So much more. Look, I'm a little bit heartened that there is more listening and respect and learning from Indigenous populations, in particularly in countries which have been colonised. And I've seen more collaborations, really interesting collaborations going on between environmentalists, ecologists, scientists, and various Indigenous communities, which bear so much knowledge. And I mean, the generosity of the Indigenous people here in Australia who come forward repeatedly say, we have this knowledge about how to manage water, how to do cultural burning, and all those things. So there's a great deal that can and needs and it should be and is starting to happen. And we also really need to, as non-Indigenous people, those of us who are, to sit and respect and listen to resilience, because as they often say in Indigenous communities, climate change has been happening for us since the day of invasion, as various ecosystems have been torn apart by not always maliciously, but sometimes maliciously and sometimes by very, an ignorant and inappropriate form of way of being with the land. So I see that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voice being very important, and we hear Indigenous-led climate campaigns very strongly, of course, around Pacific, particularly for us in our region. With young people, it's so important that we acknowledge that they know. Children generally know a lot more than parents understand about climate and ecological crisis. They feel it, and it's really important to be able to listen to children's feelings, thoughts, and for children to feel at a family level that their family that they are in a family where everyone is committed to acknowledging this, engaging with it, and taking something on as a family. And then when families come together, then to take it on as community, and in Aotearoa, the whole sense of whanau and what a whanau can do, which individuals cannot. And so I think that collaborative and collective way of engaging and really facilitating that for children is very important. I mean, I won't go so much into the whole international picture of what needs to be done, which may or may not happen at the next COP coming up, but there's enormous and very complex issues around justice in terms of different communities and the situation that we're in now, and a lot of it is about coming out of the frames that have led to the problem. How, as Einstein said, how can we solve a problem working from within the frames that have caused them? And And what will come out from the margins will be from marginalised communities, or will be from young people, or it's from ones who don't normally get to have the voice, who will be carrying the biggest messages of what needs to be done, and inspirations and so on.
So is the general theme here grounded hope? When we go back to the point that you mentioned around kids, kids know more than we realise. They can also sense and feel our own emotions as well. Is it a matter of, and I don't want to oversimplify things, but for instance, going out and planting some trees with the kids, to show them that there are positive actions that we can take. I mean, they'll know as much as we do that, climate change is accelerating, the ill effects are accelerating. We're going to feel more and more in terms of health issues and the way the land is, et cetera, et cetera. So, doing little things might inspire kids as well. Planting trees, let's be honest, you plant a few trees, it's not going to change the world. But like you say, it goes back to that grounded hope. It's look, we planted a few trees, a few birds have come back, and the soil's looking a little healthier, et cetera, et cetera. So is it figuratively and literally, is it planting the seed for the kids to help them be able to then maybe figure out themselves 20 years down the line?
Absolutely. And because this comes into a very linked issue, which is the kind of what has been called the nature deficit disorder in kids, that Western education is not getting the kids outside enough, it's getting them inside way too much, and that a child's passion and love and interest in the living world can only be fed by being out there in it, and then learning how to care. I mean, this is the biophilic instinct within us that actually gets cut off by a lot of Western education. So it's really important, whether it's in schools, and particularly as young as possible, from the kind of kindy preschool age up, to families, as well as our neighbourhoods and our bioregions, to be hooking in and seeing, look, there's something, whether it's a mangrove restoration, whether it's a tree planting that's going on, whether it's going down to the farm that's doing a bit of organic or biodynamic farming and learning how they create those carrots, and the meaning that comes out of buying those carrots that have actually resulted in the way they've grown in the soil storing more carbon. So there's so much love and learning that is there for children when we come into a more nature-based education and a more outdoor education. There's a lot of research coming out nowadays about just the negative effects of being separated from living world in terms of health systems and our education systems, but conversely the amount of very rapid improvement you see in children's educational performance when they do a lot more outdoor learning, for instance. And as for tree planting, I mean, part of the problem is we haven't understood that every life needs to plant, that for every life on this planet there needs to be trees planted and cared for and looked after. I mean, in many traditional systems, a child is born, a tree is planted, and something as simple as that, which may seem like, oh, that makes no difference, but actually if it becomes cultural change, it becomes ecological change. And so one of the ways we need to look after ourselves psychologically is to just question ourselves when we get that it's too small, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I don't buy that plastic, or if I plant the bush, the native bushes, or put out the bird bath, or whatever it is, and actually to look at all the other instances of people doing that, and how incredibly responsive our living world is. Our mind can be very immersed in the depression and the doomerism and the despair, whereas what we can see, so it's like getting back to the waterways, Ben, when you're jogging and knowing those waterways are very polluted, but also knowing that waterways are one of the most responsive ecosystems to purification and change. And there's not enough going on, I'm sure, in your region you are, but there will be something going on. And even here in Sydney, and we have seen fish return, and the Sydney Harbour going to Parramatta River becoming swimmable. which was not there 30, 40 years ago. And these instances don't tell us the bad isn't happening, but they tell us that our actions, and sometimes actions was often just quite a small but very committed group, have brought healing into ecosystems, and often bring healing to ourselves, because we will feel worse if we just sit and read and watch all of this happening. We have to actually, in some way, have our hands and efforts engaged into some reparative project that excites and inspires us.
Yeah. And I think it's really important not to undervalue the actions of an individual and what can be achieved by that. I mean, look at Greta. She started out striking by herself, and that turned into a global movement. So,
right.
I mean,
she
trees never grow if the seed
that.
doesn't get planted.
No, and that's part of understanding ourselves as a part of an ecosystem. That on one level that feels like we're very small and we don't really matter, but actually understanding part of an ecosystem is understanding that one small movement, one conversation, one introduction, one planting alters, and so if we can see where can we use our actions to be life supporting, life enhancing, that is part of it. But yes, we cannot know. Greta certainly didn't know because I remember I was following it when she first started, and she went there out of despair and desperation, just thinking, well, this is one thing I can do to just say how I feel. And that movement grew up so rapidly around someone who clearly was not looking for that kind of publicity. And this is part of what we are grappling with, and our change of worldview needs to be is to have more receptivity to uncertainty, and to develop more ease with the uncertainty. Because often part of the doomerism too is wanting to have a certain narrative rather than to actually have a uncertain of not really knowing. And in saying that, I don't mean that we don't know if climate crisis is here or not, but not knowing the specifics of what's going to happen, and not knowing if we get together a little group to work on some aspect of resilience, whether that's going to have any real ongoing significance or impact or not. We can't know, but we know that we're doing something that feels meaningful and that honours the values that we've been grieving, that have been dishonoured by a culture which has fallen into a worldview which is not life supporting.
I think most people acknowledge now that we're never going to be where we were. So climate change is here, and we're going to have to deal with it, and we're going to have to, not only continue with our mitigation efforts, but we have to adapt as a society. And you've already kind of talked to this point so brilliantly, but do you have any particular tips or tools for people, apart from, that group setting clear boundaries, going out and being actively involved, but for people who want to read further or read specifics, any tools how we can adapt emotionally and mentally and, prepare us so we build some of that psychological resilience that we need going forward?
Yeah. Look, I think a really important part of the message of my research, but not only my research, there's been other research done, and I will give you a link because I think you're going to put some links and things up after this, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Research also done by climate psychologist Rosemary Randall and Paul Hoggett, that looking into resilience of climate campaigners and climate scientists. And they found the campaigners did better than scientists, and one of the big reasons is that the campaigners, and this can be all of us, we're all we're engaging, we're all campaigners, can more consciously set up a culture of support and meaning and well-being for our work. And this is really important to me because I do come across, we get asked in Psychology Safe Climate a lot to come and run workshops for various organisations engaged with environmental campaigns. And there will be burnout unless you establish a culture to really counter that, because it's quite hard to set up any organisation which actually isn't imbued with all the kind of neoliberal values of heroism, work harder, perform more, don't stop and feel your feelings, because that's a weakness, so the kind of heroic, patriarchal and deeply destructive values. So we really need to think in terms of whether it's our groups, our organisations, our workplaces, our families, what kind of culture we actually see as a life-enhancing one, and to work out how to support that, and to talk a lot about the meaning of what we're doing, not just what needs to be done, but why is it important? What does it mean to us to work on a bit of the river to clear up that particular part of the river that your local group can work on. And so we need to both work on meaning, we need to work on support, and in our groups we need to have fun. Let's not stop playing. Our brains need fun. We need play. And so when you realise either you individually or your group you're working with is just feeling pretty ground down with it, it's really time to go and do something frivolous. That hopefully make you laugh. Because it's an essential part of being human. It's an essential part of being any living being. If and this is often why it's great to have a pet or to feel very deeply connected to more than human beings and spend time with them. Because as much as they're experiencing various things going on, they're living their lives according to instincts, and we need to honour our instincts more, and that instinct is for love and play and connection. So that's all important in terms of that, as well as, yes, the obvious things that we need to do to care for ourselves as we care for any other living being. Eat well, sleep well, exercise, realise that this isn't a short, this isn't a sprint, this is our lives and will be the rest of our lives, and we cannot bring healing in if we keep operating from an old paradigm of burnout and neglect and so on. So though it might seem like we have no time for it, actually those times we put aside for socialising, for play, times where we go and spend time with people who aren't very engaged with us is also important. So let's honour those people who aren't so engaged. They can be very helpful for us sometimes if we can just, I'm being a bit facetious here, but actually spend time doing something where this isn't the topic of conversation constantly. We need that.
And you mentioned earlier a little bit about, we're getting a little bit into science here, but, the elevation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is not, a state that you want the body to be in. So the way to regain the balance with your parasympathetic nervous system, mindfulness, breathing, exercises, yoga, again, being immersed in nature and so on. So it's getting that balance. And I think that's super key in terms of just general health and well-being, really. So
Absolutely.
I think the what we're learning here is don't treat this as something completely different. There's still a lot of the tools, a lot of the ways we can react and I guess adapt or help to adapt. There's a lot of similar tools we use to manage stress in general, I think. And so it doesn't have to be something uniquely specific. It's just, we just need good habits and good, despite what the environment is around us, we can still manage our day-to-day in a sort of more sustaining and healthful way. On that, you mentioned Psychology for a Safe Climate. You do a little bit of work for them. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organisation as a whole? Why did it come about and what's their purpose?
Okay, I'm very happy to. They're a fantastic organisation. They're Melbourne-based. They were started by a group of psychologists, I think around 2011, 2012. I first connected with them in 2013 when they had their first conference. And first, I think their primary motivation at first was to explore a lot of the psychological roots of what was going on with the climate crisis, slightly more academic approach to that. But it quickly morphed into, as the conferences and the groups revealed, the need to give support to particularly people who were engaged. And they've run a number of workshops. Typical workshops we run are ones to do with burnout and with grief, or just one where we say the climate is changing, how are you? How are you doing? How are you changing? We often find in our workshops we don't we don't do a lot of complicated stuff. We're not doing huge amounts of psychoeducation, but we're doing some, particularly around mindfulness. But we're setting up spaces, often facilitated with art-based exercises and practices for conversation, for small group conversation, so people get that space to articulate some of what they've been feeling, which might have been hard to put into words, or they feel they can't talk about in their home or their family, and also to listen to others. And there's what comes back consistently in that is the comfort of companionship there. At the moment, Psychology for Safe Climate has gone through a very successful phase of fundraising, so we're now in a position where our primary focus, as well as delivering those kinds of workshops, is to develop training, professional development for helping professions, counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, GPs, to become climate aware, and to form a network of support for people who are wanting to get help from the helping professions, from people who are climate aware and take seriously when they come and say, I'm feeling very anxious, or I'm feeling very depressed, or whatever, as a result of what I've been reading or experiencing around climate. And we're very aware now, whether we're here in Australia or Aotearoa, that there's increasing climate-driven catastrophes, bushfires, floods, droughts, whatever. And that too is becoming part of Psychology for a Safe Climate's work to look at how we can offer support in the wake of those kinds of catastrophes, or for communities who've been particularly affected by some event like that. And the organisation's going from strength to strength. There's some great people being part of this, and we hope through the training that this will grow into a much larger network, which is, thanks to going more online, becomes more available to more and more people.
Yeah, and that's definitely going to be needed moving forward as we see the impacts of climate change more in Australia and New Zealand. I think we've been quite lucky so far. It's not... I mean, the cracks are beginning to appear, but it hasn't been so tangible compared to someone trying to live their life in Kiribati, for example. But as that kind of fractures and splinters a bit more, I think we'll definitely be needing to rely on your services a bit more.
Yeah, well, again, it's about being responsive to what comes up, and I think the bushfires here in Australia, 2019-2020, caused an enormous amount of change on the ground, as well as great grief.
Yeah. And of course, before we wrap things up, we can't let you go without plugging your book, because it is really a brilliant read. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Oh, thank you, Emma. Yes, look, I wrote the book. I didn't want to publish my thesis. I thought, look, it's fine. People can access that online, and I can give that link if people want to look at that more academic side of it. But what I felt from the conversations we had in the research group, there was such rich topics of conversations. We shared our apocalyptic imaginings, we talked about death, we talked a lot about values and different ways of knowing. We talked about the nitty-gritty stuff about, should you use the shampoo that's ecologically sound but gives you blisters? We had a lot of laughs. But, there's so much stuff once you're engaged that everything has to be re-looked at and re-examined, and from big existential and philosophical issues through to those kind of nitty-gritties about how to live your life and how to deal with communication. And so I wanted to write a book that kind of opened all that up for conversation, and to give a bit of companionship to people, knowing that often people are sitting alone with this, and that the books that they might be reading on climate change often don't really acknowledge the emotional or psychological journey. And I think I particularly wanted to emphasise that it is a journey of self-development. And that was sort of what came out, and what I hope comes out in the book is that through engaging, it's not, yes, there's emotional challenges and they do need to be consciously addressed, but there is a process by which we become, our consciousness grows. It grows at a psychological level, grows at a socio-political level, and it grows at a level of ecological level. And so we grow into a kind of systemic consciousness, which leaves things which means that we can join things up a bit. And that's what I meant by reimagining our world and ourselves. And the subtitle of the book is that with consciousness change, the world looks and feels and is experienced differently, and our sense of ourself becomes very different as we start to understand ourselves in that more systemic web. And I put lots of stories in it, and because what I found, particularly reading people like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and all sorts of people who've been in this area for a lot, is that there are personal stories they had shared from time to time, and I wanted to highlight some of that process that people like that have been through. Greta Thunberg, all those people, but also people who aren't famous, but who have put a lot of work in. And so let's talk about the emotional and personal part of that journey.
Dr. Sally Gillespie, this has been a truly an important conversation that we've had and should continue to be had. We know that a lot of our listeners feel impacted in some way with some of the conversations, some of the podcast episodes that we have. Emma and I talk a lot about this, that we also sometimes feel that emotional impact from a lot of these conversations. And what you've reminded us is that it's still important to remove ourselves from it, give ourselves a break, and also look at the positive side of things. It's easy to say that, it's very cliched, but that grounded hope concept is truly important, because there is hope, and we can sometimes get so immersed in the negative that we forget that as individuals we can still make impact change, especially as a community. And at the same time, no change can happen if we're not healthy and we're not able to do that. And so we need to have that balance. We need to, balance out the negative with a lot of the positive. And you've given us some really fascinating insight into some of the tools we can use. And thank you so much. It's been a good lesson. I feel a little bit relieved. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
It's been a pleasure. It's been wonderful to talk with you both, and thank you so much for the work you're doing in a really important podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention podcast. Make sure you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends, and visit the website for more details.